But okay. Good afternoon and welcome to our panel, Censoring Palestine, Islamophobia, New McCarthyism, and Campus Politics. Part of today's symposium, Teaching Palestine, Pedagogical Praxis and the Indivisibility of Justice. My name is Shehadeh. I'm a PhD student in Anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles, where my research focuses on Palestinian social movements within the academy. I have an MA from San Francisco State University, where I have since been a lecturer within the Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies. I want to thank WOCMES organizers, all of the student volunteers who supported us throughout the conference, my fellow panelists and symposium participants, our participant audience, and a special thanks to Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi, who initiated, co-organized, and led the Teaching Palestine projects alongside Birzeit University, An-Najah National University, and the Afro-Middle East Center in South Africa. Pulling a brief summary from the call for papers, the Teaching Palestine project is a collaborative effort to critically engage the conceptualization and multifaceted practice of anti-colonial knowledge production and justice-centered knowledge production, contextualized through and in Palestine and the Palestinian diaspora. Our panelists this afternoon will discuss the emancipatory pedagogies and advocacy projects within the interwoven spaces of the academy and the community. The first conference, the first part of the Teaching Palestine conference took place in Palestine at Birzeit and An-Najah National University, alongside a collaborative research delegation, and has since convened at conferences and honorary lectures not limited to Havana, Cuba, the University of California, Los Angeles, and will soon be hosted by the Afro-Middle East Center in Johannesburg, South Africa, and the American Studies Association in Atlanta, Georgia. Let me go through. So now let me pivot slightly and very briefly introduce our panelists. We have Brooke Lorber, a professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at Sonoma State University, and is currently a scholar in residence at the Beatrice Bain Research Group in Gender and Women's Studies at UC Berkeley, and is in the process of writing her book on assessing the impact of Jewish feminism, lesbian feminism, and Zionism, and anti-Zionism, on the feminist revolution of the late 20th century. Following is Enrico Doan, a graduate student in the School of Law at the University of Washington. His research focuses on the politics of recognition and indigenous rights, taking a critical approach to the ways in which legal systems have been used to forcibly displace colonized peoples and communities. He's on the National Board of Students for Justice in Palestine. Next we have Mennah El-Gammal, a student at the University of Washington in the Department of Political Science and History. She served as director of the Middle Eastern Student Commission, a division of the Associated Students. Then we have Amani Azzaidani, who is a recent graduate of the University of Washington School of Public Health. She is a leader and organizer of the university's chapter of the Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights. And fifth, we have Saed Hijleh, a Palestinian human geographer, poet, and radio show host, who is currently working as a lecturer of political and environmental geography at An-Najah National University in Nablus, Palestine. He's the founder and director of the Center for Global Consciousness, an independent media and culture exchange institute. And his activism began quite young when he joined student demonstrations against the Israeli occupational authorities at the age of 10, and at the age of 15 was seriously wounded when Israeli soldiers opened fire on a student demonstration and shot him. As we go through our panel, each will contribute towards a dynamic analysis that historically and spatially contextualizes censorship of Palestine, with ethnographic focus on An-Najah National University, Occidental College, San Francisco State University, and the University of Washington. Our discussion will analyze the international, local, and systemic Zionist and Islamophobic targeting of Palestine and justice-centered knowledge production. Very familiar with this targeting is the General Union of Palestine Students, the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies, and Dr. Rabab Abdul-Hadi at San Francisco State University. Students and faculty continue to be smeared there, but online by Canary Mission and Campus Watch, which are blacklist websites that posted profiles of them, leading to intense harassment. They were stalked on campus, their employers called, demanding they be fired, and they were the victims of violent death threats and threats of rape. Another Zionist organization, the Middle East Forum, then started a petition demanding that SFSU cancel its academic partnership with An-Najah National University in Nablus, Palestine, on the false pretext that it was a hub of terrorism. And I must say that this MOU is the first and only official academic partnership that San Francisco State University has with any Arab or Muslim affiliated university. The David Horowitz Freedom Center initiated a smear campaign against Dr. Abdul-Hadi, accusing her of terrorism and anti-Semitism. On 4 occasions, the organization defiled campus with these posters that the university to this day has refused to hold accountable those that threatened Dr. Abdul-Hadi and GUPS. Hillel has filed charges of anti-Semitism against organizers of a Know Your Rights Fair. A Know Your Rights Fair co-sponsored by GUPS for not inviting them to have a table at the fair. And the Lawfare Project has filed a lawsuit in federal court against Dr. Abdul-Hadi and SFSU administrators, claiming they have facilitated systemic anti-Semitism at the university, orchestrated by Dr. Abdul-Hadi, and they have filed a second lawsuit on allegations of anti-Semitism in state court. These accusations of anti-Semitism rest on a deliberate conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism and are intended to stifle and criminalize anti-colonial knowledge production and Palestinian advocacy organizing. Now, my role is chair of this panel, so I'm not presenting a formal paper, but as a participant chair, so I will participate in the Q&A sessions afterwards. Now I will invite Professor Brooke Lorber to discuss teaching Palestine.
So is this good? Is this my board? Yeah. Is it on?
Oh, there. Okay, sorry. All right, thank you, Saliem. And it's great that you gave us some context about the repression of teaching Palestine on campuses, because actually most of my presentation really isn't going to focus on that, and I'll get to a little bit of that at the end, but I'm totally happy to engage that more in the Q&A, and yeah, I'll say a little more about that in the end. But mostly I'm going to talk about teaching and doing something I love. So this paper is really just my preliminary thoughts on a course that I taught a couple years ago. It's called The Practice of Coalition, Palestine Solidarity, and the Movement at Occidental College. In our effort to decolonize our education and our lives, we work at multiple scales. The question of Palestine, in the context of movements for radical social change that traverse global networks, meets and merges with liberatory modes of praxis that cross divides imposed through disciplinary logics. The cultures, affects, and ways of being we associate with decolonizing practice might be produced in our daily lives and infuse every level of our sociality, creating what Mari Spira has called intimate internationalisms that flow through the sphere of the body to our quotidian or spectacular actions and relations. In this way, political ideologies as social movements become sociocultural forms, lived collective experience that may produce effects through our education and our vocation, through our interaction with governance and policy at local, state, national, and international levels. At this symposium, I'm sharing initial thoughts that I hope will form part of a co-authored paper in which Occidental College undergraduate student Halla, Keir, and I will consider the campus as a space of exchange at which systems of oppression are reckoned with, opposed, and overturned, where struggles for justice and freedom, commonly understood as separate issues, alchemically mix and merge with results for education and for movement building. My portion of this paper that I'm sharing today is about classroom teaching. It's about a protest movement, a student club, and 10 days of organized events at Occidental College in 2015 and 2016. So as Dr. Abdul-Hadi and the Teaching Palestine Symposium ask, this paper will trace relationships between classroom pedagogy, curriculum, justice-centered knowledge production, as Dr. Abdul-Hadi asked, and student protest movements resisting racism and related systems of oppression. I argue that the Black-led student organizing on college campuses in 2015 produced what critical theorist George Katsiafikis names the Eros effect. And this is a quote from Katsiafikis about the Eros effect, which he describes as the transcendental qualities of social movements, which occur in moments of suddenly popular social upheavals, which dramatically transform established social orders produced outside the framework of planning and institutional behavior. So during the Black uprisings on college campuses, which took place across the United States in 2015 and 2016, many campus-based movements gained momentum, combined, won demands, flourished, and also learned hard lessons through fracture, repression, and demobilization instigated by authorities or through related forms of strategic losses. Each of these in their own way happened at Occidental College with effects for Palestine solidarity culture and organizing on that campus and beyond. So in this paper, I'm going to tell you a story. In 2015 and 2016, I had a one-year position at Occidental College, which is a small 2,000-student private liberal arts school in Los Angeles, California. I was based in the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice, where one professor was on medical leave and another was on sabbatical, and I was finishing my dissertation. And so there I went. And I was asked to teach a course titled Women of Color Feminism in my first semester. In that course, the course hadn't been taught for a long time. I was told it had overfilled with students, so it was like packed. And packed for Occidental's like more than 30. But you know, seminar classes. So anyway, in that class, we studied the literature and the activism of women of color feminism, really based in the 1980s. We read most of This Bridge Called My Back and many supplementary essays in a framework addressing, among other themes, settler colonialism, anti-Blackness, Orientalism, and transnational feminism. And this was really organized through the theoretical innovation identified by Grace Hong and Rob Ferguson, who argue that women of color feminism offers a framework for comparison across categories of difference. So rather than installing a proper subject for a revolutionary program, as the minority nationalisms and feminisms this movement emerged from and between both did, rather than that, in the interstice of those two paradigms, right, minority nationalism and feminism, women of color feminism both incorporates their concerns and critiques their limitations, as the analytic of intersectionality reveals. So that's really what we were working with in that class. About 2/3 of the way, and so you can see there's a quote here from Grace Hong and Rod Ferguson that women of color feminism and queer of color critique, right, both closely related, they profoundly question nationalist and identitarian modes of political organization, and they craft alternative understandings of subjectivity, collectivity, and power. And so what they're doing by showing that is they're using that as theory, right, rather than installing a particular revolutionary subject. And so that's the kind of theory that we worked on in that class, was this sort of relational formation. So about 2/3 of the way through the course, most of my stuff is not all text, but you get some text right at the beginning. So right about 2/3 of the way through the course, we read Sheila Sandoval's Mestizajes method. And in that essay, written in the 1990s, Sandoval begins to outline her analysis that is more fully realized in Methodology of the Oppressed, which she wrote, I think, in 2000. And this is the idea that late 20th century women of color feminists developed an original form of historical consciousness, allowing a different way of conceptualizing not just feminist consciousness, but oppositional activity in general. It comprised a formulation capable of aligning U.S. movements for social justice, not only with each other, but with global movements towards decolonization. So this movement, or this coalescence of movements that Sandoval is describing, women of color feminisms or U.S. third world feminisms, based in the territory of the United States, but led by women who were often immigrants, indigenous, or children of arrivants or immigrants from a colonized or decolonizing world. It could make those kinds of cross-border links because of its flexibility of ideology and strategy. And we really emphasize that in this class. So Sandoval outlines 4 strategies that are tethered to ideological commitments of social movements. And she calls these, and you can see them up here, the assimilationist mode, the revolutionary mode, the supremacist or cultural nationalist mode, and the separatist mode. And she adds to those a 5th one that she says was created by this very unique and innovative social movement, women of color feminism, which is the differential mode, meaning that all of the 4 previous modes can be engaged differentially. Like each of those becomes legitimized because they're not the one single only strategy, right? So rather than strategies, she says they become tactics. And this reparative, rather than sectarian perspective on social movement strategy became important to the students in my class and their real experience of activism. The class was offered through the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice, and so many of the students in that course were involved explicitly in student organizing, although some who were artists or poets or active intellectuals in other ways were less explicitly involved in official campus politics than others. So my sense is that this theory validated students' many forms of social change work. And then I can talk more about that. So one day in that class, one of my students, Diamond Raymond, the president of the Black Student Alliance, spoke with our class about some news that she had heard about a campus protest that was happening in Missouri. And this was Mizzou's university protest, which appeared across national news headlines within a week. It was called Concerned Student 1950, or it was also called Racism Lives Here. And the movement referred to the first year a Black student was allowed to attend the University of Missouri. It arose in response to some students being called the N-word in a really public way. Also, a swastika made out of feces was placed in a bathroom. And there was a perception on the part of students that there was a lack of response by the administration to these events. So once the movement gained the unanimous support of Mizzou's famed football team, it went really fast and it gained a lot of press. It resulted in the university president's resignation and the success of some of the student demands, as well as a loss of popularity for the school that actually lasted for a long time. So this is just a little bit of news reporting on this slide here. So this is just a little story, right, that I got from the news, which was just that, with the chancellor and the president resigning, it was kind of perceived as a very swift victory. And I will say that as it was witnessed from afar, the Mizzou protests escalated and they became contagious. So my feeling is that they sparked what I would call the Eros effect. Across the United States, Black-led anti-racist student protests swept colleges and universities, and eventually this resulted in at least 80 student uprisings at colleges across the United States. So you can see these are 80 colleges that are listed, where student movements had sets of demands that were eventually put together on one big Tumblr post. And these demands I'll talk a little bit about from the perspective of Occidental College. So students at Occidental had experienced similar forms of the normalization of hyper-racism on their campus, and that included racist-themed frat parties and the destruction of a memorial for Trayvon Martin. Students felt that those incidents were not sufficiently addressed by the college administration, which was itself and still is purportedly liberal. Increasingly, students of color voiced their analysis that the college used them as examples of its record of progressive policy, while tacitly allowing everyday racism to exist as the cultural norm. So, I heard a lot about that from students. So, a rally on the quad late in fall semester was advertised to object to what had become a well-known problem, raised as a student complaint, and these are pictures of that rally. I was really surprised when one of the students in my class, after reciting some lines by Assata, directed the crowd into the nearby administration building. "This is a takeover," she said, and this crowd of about 300 people, which is approximately 15% of the total student body, did what probably none of them had ever done before. They enthusiastically engaged a mode of civil disobedience and collectively occupied a campus building. The space was held by more than 400 students for 5 days, and it became a center to produce and negotiate student goals or demands. And you can see the students here, they're on their sleeping bags because they were sleeping in the building. It was also a meeting house, a workshop space, and a place for classes that were hosted there. So one of the last classes that I taught that semester was there. And I had just returned from the NWSA where we had done a bunch of BDS work, so I was showing them some of that. The student demands at Occidental College were these, and you can see this is from their Tumblr, Oxy United for Black Liberation, and it started with the removal of the president. And then most of the other demands have to do with a kind of sense of everyday life on campus becoming more livable. for Black students and for students of color. There was also a kind of revival of a historical demand for Black studies that they said hadn't been satisfied for 40 years. And then the other relationship was really about the local kind of scenario of gentrification, in the sense that the campus had collaborated with the Los Angeles Police Department in terms of like their safety protocol. So there was a kind of sense that withholding support for anti-Black policing and the school's contribution to gentrification was part of this multi-strategy framework. So, one evening during the student occupation, a group of students asked to meet with me, and some of them had been in the defunct Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. Some of them were members of other student groups, and all of them had joined organizing under the banner of Oxy United for Black Liberation. And so after our discussion that night, I told them that I could probably offer a course the next semester that would bring together the struggle for justice in Palestine with related US social movements, including those that they were already involved with, but that we could expand beyond those and historicize them. So I guess I just want to flag from the beginning that it felt like a collaborative experience to create this class, and that it really was a response to a student movement that was already happening. So here's the class, U.S. Social Movements in Palestine. And the course brought together the movement for justice in Palestine with anti-racist, feminist, queer, and related liberatory struggles. We began with the work of Edward Said, moving through frameworks for liberation that were codified in rebellions of 1968, critically assessing Zionism's liberal modalities, looking at women of color feminism and related formations. And I'm just going to name a bunch of the readings that we did and viewings that we did, and so you all maybe will recognize some of these names. So we started with Emma Vermont from Watching 5 Broken Cameras, moved to the Visualizing Palestine website. We read Norma Salhat, Ilan Pape, David Lloyd, Waleed Khalidi, Edward Said, the PLO, Stephen Salaita, the rapper Invincible, Rebecca Stein and Ted Swedenborg, Helga Sogosuri, Nadine Naber, Women Against Imperialism, Rabab Abdul-Hadi, Evelyn Al-Sultani, and Nadine Naber, Jasbir Poir, Tali Ben Daniel, Palestinian Queers for BDS, Scott Morganson, George Katsiafikis, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Black on Palestine blog, Paul Chamberlain, Keith Feldman, Alex Lubin, Zachary Lockman, Stephen Rosenthal, Daniel Boyarin, June Jordan, Suhair Hamad, Suran Harb, Smadar Levy, Laura Briggs, Gladys McCormick, J.T. Ray, Shalom Cohen and Kakavi Shemesh, Audrey Lord, Judith Butler, the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, Jewish Voice for Peace, Ali Abu Nima, the One State Declaration signatories, Palestinian Civil Society, BDS Call, National Students for Justice in Palestine, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the ANC, Nora Barrows Friedman, and maybe I missed some. Students also did news reports, so they followed Mon News, 972 Mag, Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, and Haaretz. And as you can imagine, through these studies, we engaged Palestine in the context of social movements that we ourselves engaged in within the United States and beyond. It's important to me to mention that the 10 students in this small course inspired great feelings of love in me and loved one another as well. It is not an exaggeration to say that in the context of this Eros effect, we built our momentary acts of solidarity through love. So I'm going to finish up by saying that in the end of the course, in the spring of 2016, students chose to do a group collaboration with one another, and so the entire class led the decolonization of the curriculum and of the school. They took our learning outside of classroom walls and did 10 days of programming on Palestine education and organizing. And they did this by engaging their movement networks. So students in this course included members of the Black Student Alliance, the Diversity and Equity Board, La Raza Coalition, and Queer House, among other student organizations. And those organizations actually collaborated with us, gave funding to produce these events. And we called this week Resilience Through Solidarity United for Palestine, and I think it took like an hour to come up with that name at least. But you can see here, this is an image of my student Cameron, working with Alam Mutaseb, and I'm sorry I don't actually have the other professor's name here, but this is Marco Monthill in one of the events that they organized. So you know, these events were really amazing, and I'm not going to say too much more about them. I'm running out of time, but this is us So we, students they contacted SJP at UCLA to borrow their mock wall. And while we were there, I'm just going to finish up by saying that although we left the school year producing, so I'm trying to figure out how to wrap up, producing a new Jewish activist group, a meeting with JDP, and also contributing to SJP, we also experienced some complaint. But before I get to that, I guess I'll just show. So these are images of my students at the mock wall, and one of my students who was in La Raza Coalition in Mecha really was motivated on the Common Struggles piece there. So we had an entire event really that was about the common investors in the wall building projects. Another one of my students who was really into arts activism wanted to make tiles that would permanently exist at the school, and so these are images of this is Halla creating a tile that says Palestine, and then this one is more on the South African theme of pride. So, so this is another event. We had Rami Kanazi and sorry that I don't have all this written down. We had a couple rappers come, and I'm sorry that I'm not remembering. And so that was a hip hop event that was really amazing. And this is the end of the year, students continuing their work with Oxy United for Black Liberation. So the one piece that I want to end on is just kind of the censorship piece. So this is a letter to the president and the kind of diversity board that was a complaint about me, of course, and it's just basically talking about an interaction that happened at the mock wall. So there was a complaint launched about me saying that my speech was anti-Semitic because it delegitimized the state of Israel. And you're not going to read this whole thing, but it says, right, it describes me as attacking the student, and that at the end of my discussion with him, I told him that he was well-versed in the Zionist narrative. And he says that the accusations from me to him, according to the US State Department, constitute anti-Semitism. And so when I went to, when I went to speak with my class about what had happened, one of the things that I had to note was that I was actually the only Jewish person in my class, and that my response to the university administration would necessarily be different from what my students would respond if they met with the same kinds of accusations, the accusation of anti-Semitism that I had met with. And I think that's sort of my question at the end of this paper, and my question in general, is what do we do with these accusations of anti-Semitism? So the State Department definition of anti-Semitism was actually never meant to be used in domestic, you could call them domestic discussions, but they are, and there's been quite a bit of training and investment in Zionist delegitimization of Palestine solidarity work to kind of turn it around. So, this is, I guess I'm just kind of introducing myself here, but this is me in 2008 working with the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, and during the bombing of Gaza, and this is my research, which is really about US Jewish feminism and how they addressed Palestine and Zionism. So when I spoke with my students about this, I felt like I had a lot to rest on, and they did too, in a sense, because they learned these histories with me. This is a historical formation of Jewish anti-Zionism from the 1970s, and of course, more current work, a Jewish critique of Zionism that we read from in our class. But I think that we need to kind of go beyond these sort of Jewish frameworks for understanding what Zionism and anti-Zionism and Jewishness and anti-Semitism might be and how they might be conceived, particularly if we actually want to engage in the practice of coalition. I look forward to working with Halla Keir on the results of the student movement, which has really been effectively demobilized, I think, in a lot of ways at Occidental College, as well as other places, and I welcome hearing your comments or your thoughts on some of my unfinished work here. Thank you.
So thank you, Saliem. Thank you to all of you for being here this afternoon. Thank you to WOCMES for having us here, for having the Teaching Palestine Symposium. Special thanks to Professor Al-Hadi for all the things you go through, all the things you do, and the ways in which you are continuing to teach and lead us. I very much appreciate that. So again, my name is Enrico Doan. I am a continuing graduate student at the University of Washington School of Law. I hold a master's in cultural studies, so that's where my training is rooted. I trace my indigenous roots to the central highlands of Vietnam. And I say that very specifically. We can get into that later, but I just wanted to point that out for you. As Saliem mentioned at the very beginning of this panel, the title of our paper today, co-authored between the three of us, is entitled Surveillance, Censorship, and Punishment, Selective Free Speech, and the Suppression of Palestine on University Campuses. So we'll keep our remarks brief because we are interested in having a very productive conversation, but over the course of the next few minutes, we'll touch on how policing of efforts to teach Palestine are made manifest on our own campus and on broader multi-scalar levels. So I'll begin by explaining very briefly the so-called Palestine exception to free speech. So in recent years, the movement for Palestinian rights and liberation has grown across the globe and has emerged as an especially strong force on university campuses in the United States. Consequently, students and scholars continue to play a crucial role in increasing public awareness about Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people and in directly challenging US complicity in Israeli violations of international law, whether through interventions in American policy or through campaigns against private corporations that directly profit from the occupation of Palestine. So in response to this activism, however, Israel has wielded its significant financial resources and political lobby to target and silence advocates for justice in Palestine through universities, various levels of government, and other institutions with significant legal weight. Palestine Legal, a US-based legal advocacy organization, has researched this phenomenon and identified several tactics used to suppress speech about Palestine. And these, in no particular order, include bureaucratic obstacles, forced dialogue, cancellation or alteration of student organization events, institutional denunciation, false accusations of anti-Semitism or association with terrorism, or terrorism point blank, administrative sanctions, threats to academic freedom, lawsuits and other threats of legal action. And not coincidentally, members of this own project, the Teaching Palestine Project, have experienced these tactics in their own lives because of their own scholarship and activism. And we are claiming that these two are inseparable. Now, I think it is also important to note that while these policing efforts exceptionalize Palestine, we are suggesting that Palestine is not actually an exceptional site. Rather, the occupation of Palestine is a product of disguised power, secular colonialism, and global imperialism. In the United States, legislation on the local and national levels provides several examples of this fact. For example, in the state of Texas, the city of Dickinson refused to provide relief aid in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, I believe that was last year, for any individuals or organizations who supported the boycott, sanction, and divestment, that is the BDS campaign, a Palestinian call, of Israel. Dickinson is just one example of hundreds of proposed articles of legislation that support Israel that are brought to the floor of the United States Congress every year, in contrast to the singular bill introduced since 2017, which is House Bill 4391, which denounces Israel's criminal treatment and imprisonment of Palestinian children. Now, I bring these examples up because we argue that in response to suppression of speech about Palestine, this project, that is, Teaching Palestine, is a critical and timely one. In recognizing the through lines between struggles of colonized peoples, we are suggesting the need to develop a radical pedagogy that centers resistance rather than coloniality and imposed power. With that, I'm going to yield the floor. I'm going to give the space over to my colleagues who will dive deeper into how we've explored this turn on our own university campus.
Can everyone hear me? Hi. So thank you to WOCMES one more time and Mr. Abdelhadi. My name is El-Gammal. I'm a student in the Department of Political Science and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Washington. The past year, I've served as the director of the Middle Eastern Student Commission, which is a part of the university's diversity wing and its student government. From now on, I'm just going to call it MESC because it's shorter. The MESC is the newest and therefore the most precarious of 13 different commissions intended to represent, advocate for, and celebrate underrepresented minority students, which is what the university officially calls them, on our campus. But before I delve into one of the experiences, which will also be kind of a story, I wanted to explain the circumstances of my hiring in the capacity of being the director, because it'll be relevant to my interactions with the administration and the censorship and silencing that happened thereafter. When I was hired, I was engaged in public dialogue with some Israeli and Zionist students who deliberately mischaracterized Palestinian colonization as being an issue of competing nationalisms between two equally opposed forces, with the intention that it would help create change on our campus. I also didn't wear the hijab. So to the university, I was the archetype of an unproblematic representative for the communities I was hired to advocate for. Kind of a safe bet of a Muslim who didn't visibly present herself as such. This was important because of years of tension that until that point had prevented the formation of the commission. We had tried to form it 10 years before and then another 5 years before and had failed. But throughout the course of the year, constituents like those of the campus SJP chapter, which for us is Super Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights, made up of students like Amani, came to me explaining that my engagement had very real and very negative consequences for the future of Palestinian representation within the commission. Essentially, they came and lobbied their representative, like all good constituents should, and they provided me with the resources to do my own research. It's through that constant process of education, which we're all talking about here, that my consciousness about the situation in Palestine began to shift. Around the same period of time, I began to wear the hijab, visibly presenting myself as a Muslim woman, which again will become relevant later on. So in context, it's important because I'll be focusing on one particular example, which was an event that we held at the MESC called the MESC Culture Fest, which was intended to educate a wider campus audience about the rich cultures and histories of the people of the Middle East and Middle Eastern students, while providing a space for students to represent their heritage in an anti-colonial environment. Individuals and student groups had the opportunity to represent their respective cultures and countries at the Culture Fest, and they were encouraged to showcase their cultural food, dance, art, and cultural dress. Due to the anti-colonial focus of the event planning, and this is going to be the key point, the MESC team and I decided not to include the State of Israel as part of the represented countries in the event. This decision was made unanimously by the team, and in part it was made to maintain the focus of the event as an anti-colonial space, but also to protect the well-being of Palestinian and other students who had been traumatized by the legitimization of Zionism on campus in the past. But this became a problem. As applications for country representations were being submitted, pro-Israel students and student groups such as Halla Stand With Us and our campus Students Supporting Israel began filing complaints against the MESC and myself personally for not including Israel in the Culture Fest. These complaints eventually escalated to higher-ups in the administration who report directly to the President of Minority Affairs and Diversity, the Provost, and the University President. These complaints intensified, which led to a meeting with my advisors in which I was asked what had happened to me, as I had been doing such good work before, and that I was not a cause for concern. That meeting also included considerations of closing down the MESC, which had only been in operation for a year and a half at that point. Where did I get these ideas from? What happened? Because the MESC could be too problematic, and that I was moving the commission in a direction that personally furthered the interest of my own politics and my own interests. Keep in mind, I'm Egyptian, and that legal action against the university was being threatened by pro-Israel groups. So in the face of this pressure, the university administration forced dialogue and requested a formal apology from the MESC, placing me in a room with 2 of the Israeli students who had complained. I'm going to count it off for you. 2 of the Israeli students who complained, a Hillel advisor, 4 of the university advisors, and a graduate student who was the head of the local Censoring chapter and an IDF soldier. So please take a moment to contextualize my situation. I was a hired representative, but I was also a student, and I was not informed that all these people were going to be at the meeting. I felt intimidated and overwhelmed, and hopefully, as it's probably not all that long ago for most of you, being a student, but I asked if I could also have representatives with me, at which point Amani and an intern of mine joined me for the meeting. I'll cut a long story short, but after a straight 45 minutes, the outcome of the meeting was that we were ultimately forced to include Israel in the Culture Fest. So look at it this way. In examining the sequence of events, I argue that the university was positing itself as a neutral arbitrator between two supposedly equal and supposedly equally opposed actors, which they're intentional actions. So they not only failed to consider historical context, but also normalize violence and deem that the trauma of one group of students is acceptable. Relatedly, and speaking to WOCMES on the whole, as we've been to several panels, something that we've noticed that is similar to our university. The university's failure to consider historical context is in conversation with similar language used when we're talking about the Middle East in general, and the people who come from there. Too often the region and its people, as were told to me in my meeting, they're couched in problematic terms, being labeled as troubled by ancient sectarian differences and religious conflict. And that rhetoric dehumanizes, decontextualizes, and exceptionalizes the Middle East, along with Palestine, as being inherently and incurably violent, and providing justification for the censorship of their speech and silencing of their representation. So at its heart, biased institutional treatment ultimately silences the education of Palestine. More importantly, the silencing isn't due to an offhand advisor. Rather, these practices are systemic. My advisors were all hired by and directly reported to the university president, provost, and board of trustees. The silencing isn't a coincidence, but like I said, systemic, and furthers an agenda of maintaining the status quo within the university structure. So what do you do? Within the institution, the opportunities one has to counter the issues of administrative challenges and bureaucratic challenges are different than those outside of it, and very much internal. I suggest that turning the pedagogical praxis that we're talking about, of the entire project of teaching Palestine, is developing. So throughout the course of the year, and most especially surrounding the time of Culture Fest, I actively spoke to those in similar positions that I was, like the directors of the Black Student Commission, Dr. Larasa, and the American Indian Student Commission, explaining the context of the situation. I emphasized that what was being done at Culture Fest would be worrisome and had implications for their constituents as well, and did so by drawing parallels between our communities and between theirs, and how their constituents might face similar treatment from the university. So one of the examples that I gave was it would be absolutely ridiculous for the American Indian Student Commission to have an event, to have a powwow, which they hold every year, and to ask 16th generation Americans to come and represent themselves as being Native American, because it is settlers again, and colonization again. Same thing with apartheid in South Africa. The Black Student Commission would never be asked to represent white South Africans as being part of Black culture. So to the representatives of the other student groups, making these parallels helped, and that education helped. The implication that they had, that disparate treatment of the university might threaten the potential for collective progress later on. And they recognize that liberatory projects are actually intertwined. Despite the understanding that universities and educational institutions tend to move at a very glacial pace, our censoring of intervals and struggles suggests that cyclical education within these institutions can lead to genuine shifts in collective consciousness, as it did for myself and for my coworkers. This project therefore paves the way to reimagining how we claim and use the university as a transformative site. Okay. So hello, and thank you to WOCMES for having us speak at your panel today, and especially to Professor Abdul. I'm Amani, a recent graduate of the School of Public Health at the University of Washington. I will be speaking to Mennah and Enrico's analyses from the lens of a Palestinian who was active in the activist sphere, and also whose family was ethnically cleansed from their homeland, and who found both community and erasure in the activism sphere at its local camps. So throughout my time at the University of Washington, I was a leader of a Palestinian student group that Mennah's mentioned called Super. The group transformed from being nothing more than a reading group for white graduate Jewish students into a politically mobile body with strong ties to other groups that advocate for marginalized communities. Our group is now well known throughout the Pacific Northwest, and now graduated, I can proudly say that there are 3 new Supers in 3 different universities across the state of Washington. As Palestinian students, we can rarely lay claim to our identity in any sense of the word. The university, as per the Palestine exception that both Mennah and Enrico have discussed, cringes away from the Palestinian in whatever capacity that it can. The university's desire to depoliticize us, its most controversial student identity, resulted in the Palestinian student being left with one of 2 options. Either 1, silently accept the depoliticization and thus ignore the systemic erasure of their identity and oppression, or 2, fight back, break the university rules, and teach Palestine in whatever way we can. Mennah's point that our university is attempting to enforce a neutral environment in which the university is posited as an impartial arbitrator between 2 equal and opposite forces, Israel-Palestine, is especially crucial in this discussion, as doing so erases and silences Palestinian voices. In the case of the Culture Fest that Mennah's discussed, Super had a particular role to play in breaking through that suppression of speech. As Mennah stated earlier, in the context of the Amazing Culture Fest, Super educated those within the institution, including Mennah herself and her colleagues, leading to a domino effect of institutional employees of the student government becoming advocates for Palestinian human rights themselves. Focusing on the cultural night itself, however, it was clear that Israel's presence was an imposition of colonialism, a distinct act of violence. So over the course of time before the fest, Super engaged with members of the student body through teach-ins, community seminars, and collectively wrote a statement protesting the forced inclusion of Israel. So we wrote a speech to be made at the Culture Fest to let everyone know that it was completely unacceptable and completely an act of violence that Israel had to have been included at the fest. In reading out this statement, as you can see, we read it out uninvited, and we addressed the violent consequences of the university's actions. Super introduced the people in the room to Dabke, as you can also see, a classical dance, and now a form of resistance and a symbol of Palestinian identity. Palestinian identity, which is already an inflammatory notion, and the expression of that identity was an act of resistance, combating dominant narratives. So it's a declaration that Palestinians exist, are constantly resisting colonial violence, and are educating others about their decades-long struggle, and at times, their humanity. So in response to this collectively written speech and the Dabke performance, Super received chants of "Free Palestine" from the crowd of approximately 400 people. Imagine. Finally, by the end of the night, the diversity coordinator of the student government, who had been one of those at Mennah's meeting, the antagonists, right, that we had to meet with, came up to us and apologized and indicated her shock about the extent of the university's complicity in our silencing and our delegitimization. So educating through these platforms and tactics actually enacts genuine intangible change that I will expand on in a moment. There's another example. Actually, can we go to the next slide, please? This is what the Israel table looked like. It was completely a cluster of Israeli and Zionist political artifacts, right? So you saw that they've been advertising for the IAC, which is the Israeli American Council, that are just completely political. So though they had said that they were going to be there for a cultural endeavor, they were actually there to enhance the hasbara of the Israeli campaign. Moving on, another example of how Super has been engaged in a pedagogical praxis and that contests dominant narratives and claims space was in the events of a collaboration with the Food Cooperative. The Food Co-Op, also a group within the student government, is led by radical activists from various backgrounds.
The group, unsurprisingly, faced direct limitation and backlash from the university when it began to ask for university authorization and funding for its collaboration with us, the Palestinian student group. This event was to be a hummus and tabbouleh recipe demonstration that spoke to Israel's appropriations of Palestinian food, as well as to unethically sourced Israeli products such as sabra hummus, as we all know. Due to its extremely political nature, right? As stated by the advisor to the food co-op, the event was to be shut down. But after much persuasion by the more privileged, and by privileged I mean white, members of our groups, and after their collective concession to omit the word boycott from the presentation, the university reluctantly allowed us to continue with the event. On the day of the event, however, we presented an uncompromised and unapologetic teaching seminar that emphasized the necessity of the Palestinian call to boycott Israeli products and companies that profit from their death, displacement, and dispossession, admitting it seemed too apologetic and not at all Palestinian. So we did. Perhaps most surprisingly, after this very successful collaboration, which fed and educated dozens of people, the same advisor to the food co-op who had attempted to shut us down apologized for a trouble that the group had gone through. So this direct act of defiance and resistance and reclamation of space led to multiple important results. First, a lot of people showed up. A lot of people learned about what Palestine was. A lot of people who didn't know even the basics of Palestine. And people who, if we had continued to shut down the event, would never have known. And ultimately, the fact that teaching Palestine had the impact of the groups, both groups, receiving an apology from the same administrator who had initially attempted to shut us down was really significant in our trajectory as a group. But why? What does this institutional recognition do for us? And how does the process of teaching Palestine need to continue in these ways? Well, I argue that this apology is a form of institutional recognition. This recognition therefore sets the ground for more productive and ongoing conversations between our institution and other politically contentious groups. Thus, we need to continue to push teaching Palestine so that the Palestinian voice ceases to be delegitimized under the guise of two equal and opposite sides of an issue, and is finally recognized as a legitimate narrative of a people and a struggle that are being erased under this very system of depoliticization. Thank you.
My voice.
لا no, you have to use the microphone.
Here I can.
Enrico can use the microphone.
Assalamu alaikum everybody. Hello, good evening. My name is Saed Hijleh, and as Saliem said, I teach at An-Najah National University. I'm here to speak as an academic, also as a poet, and also as a Palestinian who went through the whole spectrum of Israeli oppression. The title that you see on the program here is Palestinian Education Under Israeli Occupation, Pedagogical and Ethical Implication, but I added the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, what Palestine can teach us and how to teach it. And this is something I'm working on, trying to develop like I can say a holistic pedagogy, but something that can bring all the theoretical, practical, and activist aspects of teaching Palestine together. Today is actually the 100th birthday of Nelson Mandela, or yesterday it was.
Yesterday.
So Amandla. But I want to say, unfortunately, that they brought the statue of Nelson Mandela and put it in the Bantustan of Ramallah, and really ignoring the legacy that secular democratic South Africa, cannot be confined to Bantustan of Ramallah. I just wanted to say this today is his birthday. I was thinking this morning about this philosophical aspect of pedagogy and how to apply it to Palestine, and then to see how to bridge the gap between formal and informal education vis-a-vis Palestine. The Buddha said, this is what I told this morning, when the student is ready, the teacher shall appear. When the student is ready, the teacher shall appear. I think in the Palestinian context we can also say, when the teacher is ready, the student shall appear. And here I would like to say dissolving the boundaries between formal and informal education, or at least merging them together. And there is a whole matrix of formal and informal education, and this is how we should, I think, see teaching Palestine, not only in the academic setting, but also in academic and academic setting. Once we did something called Classrooms Beyond Borders, and talking about blended education. This is I will start with something saying that in 2010, we did in the World Education Forum, we did a workshop on Palestinian prisoner education, and Professor Baba Abdelhadi was there. It was amazing. And we got ex-prisoners, 2 females and 2 males. It was amazingly enlightening. And one of the professors, ex-prisoners, now is a professor. The other was a student who was came out, a young woman who was coming out from prison after 5 years. And after she got out of prison, a settler ran her over, and she was in a coma for a year. And then she revived, and she's back to school trying to, and I was translating, if you remember, I got so emotional. She was drawing windows inside, she's an artist. She was drawing windows inside the prison cell so her female prisoners can see a light, And she said, I physically got hurt, but I will continue. And I was translation, I started crying, I couldn't even continue the translation. I remember that. So as Hijleh said, we cannot separate our emotions and passion when we talk about teaching Palestine, because we live it. We live the tragedy, the continuation of the Nakba. And here, a note on pedagogy. Pedagogy is not only the methods of teaching, but also it's the philosophy of teaching and learning. And pedagogy is dialectically linked with the modalities of knowledge production and reproduction, dissemination, sharing, and presentation. Knowledge in its multitude of formats can thus be used in the production and reproduction of oppressive socioeconomic and sociopolitical orders by serving the interests of colonial powers or elite in different societies. And thus, disenfranchised people or oppressed people around the world cannot fight or resist oppression in its various forms if they do not develop a pedagogy that is capable to counter and eventually defeat the web of hegemonic knowledge of the oppressor. This is relevant to academia, to the media in all its formats and platforms, and now social media, and also to the other informal educational settings. So no pedagogy without also epistemology. The way we acquire knowledge and how we interpret it and what to do with it, okay, with that interpretation and understanding makes a big difference. Consequently, epistemology and pedagogy are linked dialectically again with the process of identity formation, both personal and collective. Okay, how to teach Palestine? I will tell you a story. I was director of public relations for An-Najah National University between 2005 and 2007. I used to have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on my wall, and we hosted many delegations. And you see the relevance of Palestine to the people who are coming from different and divergent, backgrounds. I used to ask anybody from the delegation, American delegation or French, can you please go stand and close your eyes, stand next to the, oh, sorry. Are you telling me the time or not? How much time do I have?
You're good on that.
Okay. Because can you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has 30 articles? Close your eyes and just point to any of those articles. Open your eyes, see, and ask honestly yourself: is Israel in violation of any of that article? So basically, Palestine is relevant and to all aspects of human existence in terms of like violation of human rights. People who are interested in women are can women's studies or can relate to Palestine. People with children, anyway. So, what kind of pedagogy can we use to teach Palestine? Of course, here I would like to suggest that there are a lot of theoretical frameworks for teaching Palestine, whether we're talking about the colonial aspect of the conflict, or not conflict, of Palestine, settler colonial aspect, or if we can talk about the indigenous, or about talking about resistance. There are many theories can apply. Maybe a lot of people can use a structuralist approach or a Marxist approach to discuss Palestine. Some people neo-Marxist approach, a word system approach, core and periphery. Where does Palestine fit within the core, periphery, and semi-periphery? And then as we discussed earlier, within the periphery, there's core and semi-periphery and periphery. I would like to talk about my experience in teaching Palestine, and maybe in the discussion we can elaborate more about my pedagogy. I use something called the academic theater. In my classes, I'm almost like acting. I sing, I use poetry, because again, going back to the student-teacher dichotomy. Who's teaching who? Who's teaching who in the classroom? I have students who are ex-prisoners. I have students who are going through the same reality and experiencing it and producing knowledge through this So who's teaching who? I'm learning from them and they're learning from me. Okay? Again, for example, I take tours to ex-prisons like Al-Far'a prison. When I was young, I was in jail 3 or 4 times in this prison called Al-Far'a. It's in the Jordan Valley. We were, as young, this was during the 80s, as young people, the Israelis actually made a big mistake. They got all the activists and incarcerated us in this prison. Actually, they brought us all together instead of, we had people from Jenin, we had people from Ramallah, and then it got us a chance to meet in this prison. We were tortured. It was really horrific. I wrote poetry about it. But now I was taking people on tours, but how did this start? I had an American friend of mine who was going to the AUC, American University of Cairo. He came to me in 2008. He said, Saed, I know you were in prison in Al-Far'a. Can you please take me there? I said, man, I haven't been there since 1983. I don't know how I feel. He said, please, I want to do some research. And I took him. It was like maybe after 23 years I wasn't there. I got in the prison and then all these flashbacks. So I was here, I was there, he was taking notes, he was taking photos. He's an academic, but he was taking notes, he was doing this. And then it was amazing. Oh, this memory, flashback memory, I was a veteran at 18, I was tortured, I was shot, I was, and it was coming out and he was recording it. He was writing it, and then it was the first master thesis on Al-Farah. And then he did his PhD on Al-Farah, basically. Michael Kennedy, you can check his stuff, also his photography. And then we said, okay, let's do, this is now the extension of the classroom. The extension of the classroom, not only confined, because actually we have universities of de-learning. As Rashid Khalid yesterday said, instead of i'lam, tajdeed. Okay? Because pedagogy, you can teach people to become fascist. Or you can teach people to become neoliberal, slaves. And pedagogy is very important. So we extended this. We did workshops in the prison where we had the cells of torture. And I had we brought ex-prisoners, one of them, Dr. Sami Kilani, I think you know him. He is also a poet from An-Najah. And then I brought my friend who did not go to school because his name is Qais. Qais in the 80s was also shot with me. They shot him right down here in his throat, and it went up here. And then he was exiled for 5 years in prison for treatment. I call him the philosopher of the street. I call him the philosopher of the street. So we had this panel in the middle of where we were tortured, and we projected Michael's pictures on the wall, his photographs. It was amazing. So then Qais said about the Oslo context of this. He said, look, when I was in Al-Farah, now Al-Farah is turned into a youth center by the Palestinian Authority. He said, my fear is that Israelis will invade us and return Al-Farah, and my son will go into this prison. And he said, it's really amazing, I'll never forget this. He said actually Oslo and what the Palestinian Authority is doing in terms of mitigating this asymmetrical conflict by camouflaging it, by this so-called peace process, the two-state solution, and a national project that's not going nowhere for 25 years. He's saying our tears and wounds is like this candle. And every time, the candle brings those wax things, they come and just like wipe the wax. So it looks new, renovating the peace process. That was so powerful, Anyway, so, facts. I told you I have an avalanche. Actually, I'm sorry, I have so much, I did not know what to choose to speak about. It's only 15 minutes. I usually do, for part of my activism, is I give lectures for internationals who come to Palestine. We have several NGOs, and I host international delegations. Of course, we collaborate a lot with Rabab. Amazing. We did one on color. We did one on prisoners. Many delegations. But I also give lectures to this local groups called Project Hope. They host long-term volunteers, and every 1 month, when the new volunteers come, I do 2 hours. I do 1 hour of history and background, and then 1 hour of discussion. The first thing I do with these delegations, and this is part of my pedagogy, the first spot, I take them to the cemetery. We start our tour in the cemetery. Why in the cemetery? I tell them, so you can see the end result of the Israeli occupation. The end result. My mom was assassinated in 2002. I wrote about her. Her name is Shehadeh and Hijleh. I wrote the website. 5 of my, my mom was a peace activist, a philanthropist, and a women activist. And in October 2002, during the invasions, we were on curfew. We were sitting in our house. Israeli jeeps stopped by, and my mom was doing embroidery, and they just stopped. My dad was taking time. We were peacefully in our house, 36 meters away from them. And then my mom said, wait a little, because the jeeps are, pass by. Usually they pass by and say, curfew or something. They stop, and I waited, and then suddenly they just opened fire on us. Like death squad activity, they riddled us with bullets. They shot at her head, she was like this, they shot her in the... It's horrific, it's a horrific experience. And it's really, can you imagine, to bring this experience to the classroom? Bringing this experience to the classroom. I mean, if I live like 10 times, I will never forget these few seconds. And my dad was also injured, I was injured. And, they killed her. There's a website for her, remembershannon.org, I can put it. But I take the delegation to the cemetery and I say, and I take them and tell them the story of martyrs. Some are students, some are just like older men, some are women. And then this is to learn. It's not an abstraction. Teaching Palestine is not an abstraction. It's a grinding our lives. Okay? Yes, we can try to theorize and try to see the reasons and try to think of ways to end this crime. I once wrote a poem called Palestinian Superman, and I added Superwoman because I wanted to be gender. You must be Superman to live in Palestine. You must use all your senses 24 hours a day in order to stay. You must hear the gunfire, then the screams that fade away. You must see blood again and again and still see red. You must smell tear gas and cry as if there are not enough tears in this holy land. And you must taste humiliation and eat Nablusi kinafe sweets all in the same day. And then, but still, you have to think of the olives and thyme and think of ways to end this endless crime. Oh my beloved, do we still have time to hold hands and kiss and raise our children in a cosmic bliss? This is what I do in my classroom. This is what I do in a global classroom. Okay? Because the other day, just yesterday, I met this woman. Sorry, I don't know if she's in the audience. Hello, hi, where are you from? I'm from Poland. Oh, I'm from Palestine. She goes, oh, I'm from Poland and I'm Zionist. Oh, wow, thank you. And I said, you're an academic. We had a discussion. She said, you should grow out of this, And then she came to the why Jewish state. I think she was like probably dumbfounded. And that was great. Anyway. What else in the pedagogy of activism? We did BDS An-Najah local because we also need BDS in Palestine because Israeli products are all over. We took us 2 years to empty the campus from this, and of course we had meetings and we had to discuss this with the students, and the students have to, also cyber activism. The students are now, Palestine is big not in Twitter, it's in Facebook. So a lot of the events are, I wrote a lot about media and media activism from cyberspace to terra firma. You organize a cyberspace and then you go to the streets. And, a lot of students groups have used it. Now we are supporting a local student theater called Saed. They're doing amazing, lovely. My friend Keir and I, Keir is the philosopher of the street. My nickname is the Palestinian dinosaur. So we are collaborating in helping these young Palestinian students doing this beautiful theaters called Rasael. Rasael means messages. And their messages are going global now. You should check them, Rasael. I can provide you with this one. Anyway, I don't know if I just like, have 1 minute, just, fighting again. I talked about the education pedagogy that needs to break the cycle of oppression. Intercultural learning is really part of this, and that's why I have this media, because, it should go both ways. Palestinians always demand that the world needs to know about them. But we need to know about the world. We are ignorant. A lot of students are ignorant. And not ignorant about sometimes about Palestine, but we need to learn about South Africa, learn about Latin America. In my classes, I bring Malcolm X, I bring Stephen Pico, I bring, the discussion between, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. It's amazing. It's amazing. And they need to learn about that. Of course, I was supposed to talk about these regulations. A lot of people have talked about this regulation to, the rights of education, a whole list of, the closure, the incarceration, the silencing. We have teachers going to administrative detention for years. Professor Ashkar from An-Najah spent 5 years in administrative detention, and now they arrested him just like 2 weeks ago. The killing, assassination, Dr. Khalid, he got killed, and his son, the killing, a lot of. But again, I would like to maybe end this and maybe this one of discussion. The layers of the context that we need to teach them, because this is very important. Now we're in this Oslo context. Oslo was an agreement to reach an agreement, but we never reached an agreement. And now we have an authority with no authority under the superstructure of the occupation, trying to co-manage the occupation. So I call it not conflict management, I call it occupation management. And we are teaching within that context. And to be honest with you, and I say this, I'm very vocal on Facebook, and people tell me, man, you know, aren't you afraid? Because I'm very critical from the top down. You know, when our president says something wrong, I say you made something wrong, and people say, hey, no, I'm not afraid they're going to put me in jail. I said, you know, I'm only afraid of Allah, inshallah. And I say this, sadly, if Oslo structure continues, we are becoming a police state without becoming a state. And actually, now you could see it from the regression of the support with Gaza last week. The last thing I would like to say, because I think out of, this is very important for very good. And I think it's also to be loyal to the soul of this person. Wafa. I want you to show you this guy. I wanted to write about Bassel Araj. Bassel Araj was a young Palestinian and who really lived the praxis of resistance. And I wanted to write this is a new project, a geography of praxis in the mind of an engaging and confronting intellectual. He called it engaging intellectual. He said, if you're an armchair Marxist or a theorist, and you're not confronting the oppression, you're nothing. You're nothing. And of course, he went into this theory of disappearance because, you know, now we're all naked now. They can assassinate us anytime. So he disappeared for 1 year, and then they caught up with him. And you should read his stuff. I really compare him with Gramsci. The practice of Bassel Araj. So I dedicate this to his soul. It's I think they closed it by accident. Anyway, I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and we continue the discussion.
Thank you, everybody. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a few questions for Q&A. And so let's start. Please go for it. I have a few questions. Just pull up the. Okay, we have technical difficulties. All right, we'll skip that. Okay. Sure, we'll take a series of questions. Please. We'll do two together.
Actually, my question is for you, Salim and Amani. I have been reading for a few days now, or maybe a few weeks, about student activism in the States. I can see that after maybe starting with 1999 or and after, you have a lot of waves of activism. But it is continued for 4 or 5 years, and then we have a new movement, a new wave. What is the reason and what is the solution? Or is it the healthy situation? I don't know if it is the right way.
In my experience, well, first, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of student activism in the United States is what happened with the Black Liberation Movement, and also in connection with that, the South African movement, right? So the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that happened from South African civil society that transferred onto American campuses. And then you started slowly seeing change with more and more people being empowered and being aware, and the denormalization of apartheid and racism through the university students' efforts. You started to realize, and there started to be more and more normalization of other types of activism. So, for example, right now, and this isn't new. None of these movements are new, right? So the undocumented student activism is not new. The Black Liberation Movement is not new. The Palestine activism movement is not new. The only thing that really changes is the exposure and what's normalized and what on campus is considered too controversial and uncontroversial. And Mennah can speak to this as well. But when we talk about things like the Palestine exception, there's a reason for the exception, right? And as we've discussed, it has to do with the fact that the university or Zionists or the status quo exceptionalizes certain movements. And so though, as of right now, the BLM movement, yes, in some regions is really controversial. In Seattle, it's considered one of the primary focuses of activism on the campus. But why is it that the BLM movement is a lot less controversial than the Palestine movement? And why is it now that we're starting to think that the Palestine movement is recent, is new, when it hasn't been? And that has a lot to do with social media, the fact that Palestinians who are active in Palestine are able to connect with students here through Twitter and through Facebook, through YouTube. So there's a lot of complexities that go into that question. But in summary, I think a lot of it has to do with what we exceptionalize, what we, and what we're most exposed to.
Yeah, and I think relatedly too, there's kind of an inherent nature of turnover within universities because people have to graduate at some point. So there is that constant cost of education. So you're constantly getting a new wave of students, and this was a problem for me in my work as well because our positions are one-year positions in the university. So they have diversity wings, they have diversity commissions, but they hire you for a year. You can reapply, but again, you still have to graduate because you are a student. And so you hire someone else, and the hope is that you train them well enough that they can continue that activism work. The problem too that we find, and I don't really know what the solution is, at least in Washington State, especially in liberal universities, or supposedly liberal universities, there's this kind of apathy. There's this idea that things are okay. You know, it's not that bad. And you know, even talking to one of the people here, we were at the concert, and he came from the University of Portland, or Portland State? Portland State. And he, you know, we're talking, he was saying he was in one of the panels, and he's the director of the Middle Eastern Studies at Portland State, and, you know, he's very upset that, that someone dared claim in one of the panels that the U.S. is moving towards fascism. The U.S. is moving towards, you know, acts that are reminiscent of Germany prior to the Holocaust. And he was just, this American exceptionalism is just so stuck in his head. And both of us had a very visceral reaction to that, saying, well, you know, putting children in cages is getting there. And there's this idea that, like, you know, if we're a liberal space, if we're a liberal university, then things are not that bad. So we don't need to do as much. So when you're talking about Black Lives Matter, like, you know, Eric Garner, all these people, Von Martin, there is a spark, and people do get angry, and there are these mass movements. But what we often see is that after that spark, after that initial anger, like you're saying, it lasts a couple of years. But the people who have the most stake in it are always the ones who stay fighting. And I don't really know what the solution to that is. Maybe it is what we're saying is more education and just constantly, I think too, like when we're talking about different modes of education, the thing that's helped me the most and that I found most helpful is personal narratives. And you know, it feels weird to say, you know, I have a friend who XYZ this happened to, but that kind of education becomes really personal and it stays with people forever. So there is that constant turnover, but I think for me the thing that's been really beneficial is having those personal narratives as education.
So I think I do want to respond to that question, but I also do want to take more questions as a collective so that we can all respond. So if you have a question too, if you could.
More of a comment than a question. My name is Yoav Shemelkot from Strasbourg University, France, but from Israeli background. To highlight, I think that in a way, if you're aware or not, that it's really for at least the Israeli regime now, the Israeli government, this is really the front now, the new front, after the Iran atomic bomb or whatever. It's the BDS movement and its attraction to young Americans, especially from Arab or black origin. So this is really like, it's not just here in WOCMES an interesting panel, it's really the new generation of resistance and the new threat that Israel is the best men of Israel's secret services, etc., are really dealing with this new front. So it's really serious stuff. I think that's my comment. Is are you aware of this? And it's the enemies you were referring to, your rivals such as NGOs, Stand With Us and others. Of course, the Israeli government is behind them, and there are more and more money and resources in this public diplomacy or hasbara, as you mentioned. Just to mention, I'm studying a bit on Israel. There's the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Public Diplomacy, which is a recent new ministry that popped up after they collapsed. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is no longer useful. And then this ministry has more and more budget every year, and nobody really knows where the budget is going to. It's quite secret. So it's and we know now that it's going to consultancy, law consultancy, to do what you guys to attack this kind of activities also personally. So you're well situated to know that. But this is just to finish that I think you maybe should be aware that this is quite serious, and so maybe when you train others also to defend and protect yourself from this kind of state, of course, backlash from this government.
As Palestine activists, we're all very aware of the fact that we're fighting against a nation with billions of dollars, aimed at us to silence us. A lot of that comes from the fact that we've had personal interactions, really negative and toxic ones, with people from SSI and IDF soldiers. And I don't know if you guys have heard, but there are soldiers, veteran soldiers that are being sent to UC schools in California to intimidate students and silence them. And a lot of the tactics that have been used against us personally have been lawsuits, right? And so they'll tell us, if you do X, Y, or Z, we can file a lawsuit against you. And they have an unlimited amount of resources because they're funded by the Israeli government, right? To have the time and to have the money to be able to throw these lawsuits at us that'll ultimately silence us. So we have had a lot of exposure to the fact that we're fighting against a nation state with billions of dollars aimed against us. And it's something that not only are we very aware of, but it's also something that is driving us to push through and resist. Because we know that no nation is going to aim billions of dollars against you and to dox you, even through Canary Mission and through other sites and sources and resources, unless you're making a severe change to their system of apartheid.
Can I just add that it would be really useful if Israeli scholars would work to expose the mechanisms that you're talking about, because that research is actually really hard to do. And it would be probably considered really cutting edge and really attractive research if people would try to do some of that work.
And one of the things that I was thinking about when we were talking about these waves of activism is that when you made the reference to Gramsci, I was thinking about the war positioning and the war maneuvering in this. Yeah. How is it that, as activism, we are responding to different, contemporary actions that are taking place, but there's also the fact that as you shared, there's a long history and genealogy of Palestinian activism. And you build up and you respond and you engage in activism, but it's not, as we're also talking about, it's highly policed and criminalized. And so you have for generations the targeting and criminalization of Palestinian activists and scholars. You have the INS, you have the State Department, you have the FBI, you have all of these different policing forces that have gone on to college campuses and arrested Palestinian students, deported Palestinian students. These are all parts of larger, you have like the counterintelligence program that targeted liberation movements, not exclusively, but larger liberation movements, the Black Panther movement, the American Indian movement, and the feminist movements, Chicano movements. You have one of the titles that we have on this panel is called New McCarthyism, and I thank Dr. Blahadi for that theoretical framework. But it's a parallel analysis of how what other panelists are talking about today is that the attempt to not only criminalize Palestinian activism through like policing forces, but also to institutionalize it and to legislate it. And so you have what I think are, you have these waves of response, and I actually really, really enjoyed your discussion of Eros. Eros, was it? I haven't. Eros effect. And so how a spark can really manifest into a massive and grassroots campaign that takes hold across that, and it's not bounded to that specific site, but it's transnational. It moves across spaces. It's not confounded to an individual, but a larger collectivity. And so I think that I think that there's so many structural reasons and so many different. I have two pressing questions here in the front row.
I actually want to, if I may, engage in this discussion, building on what you said and what you said, Amani, in the sense and in response to Ahmed, partly. We have long discussion, but I think also in addition to what you said, there is something about because of the fact that students graduate. And what happens on campuses, this also shows why it's really important to institutionalize academic programs. Because if you have academic programs, if you have curriculum, people continue being taught, and it takes a lot of load off the shoulder of the students, activists. I mean, still the education outside of the classroom continues to needed to happen. But this also paves the way for many discussions. It also legitimizes, in terms of the value of knowledge, that there is discussion in the curriculum, that it is not just happening outside of the classroom. So there is today, part of the campaigns is to actually silence any kind of programmatic, not to allow institutionalized programmatic things, because now you have the intimidation of the students, you have the tons of money that's coming in and the tactics. It's not just the money, the tactics, the money, the connections, but also the Trump administration and the people in the Trump administration who are controlling everything. And I think this is, so that is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it that links also to what you were saying, Salim, is that there is the link, there is the missing link between scholars who have privilege, who have more privilege, to see that this is something that's going to affect them. That this is not just about Palestine, and it's not just about saying something against the system and so on. That this is going to come. Once people are silenced, it's going to silence everybody. I mean, this is where the whole notion about fascism getting closer, is it fascist or it's not fascist? And I'm not going to engage in that discussion, because that requires a whole lot of discussion. But do we have the features of it? Do we have that happening? Do we have it is going on. So the problem is that to making and actually posing Palestine as an exception really complicates that. Because once you say Palestine is an exception, why should anybody else care? Why should other people care? If you think of it as a question of injustice, then it's actually something that affects all scholars, and sometimes picking the link, like what happened with Al-Aid, pick the link, the weakest link, which is Palestine. When you pick the weakest link and attack Palestine because you have the strong Zionist movement doing it, it facilitates the job of the people who want to suppress any kind of speech, any kind of advocacy, any kind of transformation, because you get rid of Palestine. And then this is what happened with the laws that happened in 1980s, early 90s, with the Los Angeles 8 case, for example, that were codified and legislated in the post 9/11 Patriot 1, Patriot 2. I mean, all of this stuff is not new, and I think that's really one of the challenges for the the Justice for Palestine movement, as well as for the intellectual way of thinking about it. And when we keep saying exceptionalizing, that actually becomes really a serious problem.
I just wanted to inject into the discussion about surveillance and transnational movements that our opposition is transnationalized too. So in JVP we have a whole campaign called Deadly Exchanges, and we try to expose the links between Zionist organizations in this country and the training of police in the U.S. Yeah, sorry. It's late. I'm tired. In the U.S. and the whole industry of surveillance and policing in Israel, Israeli industries and the exchanges that go in multiple directions and are very localized, LAPD, Ferguson Police, NYPD, and these exchanges, we have members of our city council going on these junkets free to Israel to learn about these things. They try to get especially young and new politicians and local leaders of color and bring them to Israel. And they can pay for this. And they vaunt their amazing technologies of surveillance and control. Well, I think we have to figure out strategies of turning that around through our uses of social media, through our uses of transnational networking. We are also transnational. We have exchanges. I'm thinking we've got to be sending not just delegations to Palestine, but as Ahmed said, students to Palestine and trying to break through this visa barrier. It's another wall.
I mean, I think that there's been a lot of that, and I do think that there's been a lot of exposure of those kinds of transnational ties. So, like during the Ferguson uprising, there was a lot of exchange on social media. It seems like it's important to, I mean, I think that those are grounds for building forms of solidarity, and also if we actually genuinely care about injustice, then it's not only because we see similarities, but because we actually genuinely care about one another's struggles. So I guess it just also seems important to say when we're talking about social movements and we're looking at repression that the balance of power is extremely unequal. And I just think it's important to be realistic about the situation that we're in. So if we're talking about student movements being short-lived, or we're talking about our ability to do kinds of solidarity work, transnationally, to be less than the Israeli state can invest in sending people all over the world. I mean, the truth is that we're facing, the biggest militaries in the world with the largest budgets that there are. And so I think that we're doing a lot.
I just want to really quickly respond to that too. I was born and raised in Los Angeles in '97, post the LA riots of '92, right? So I have not known an LA that has not been intensely racially charged, intensely divided along neighborhood boundaries, intensely policed. Now a transplant in Seattle, one of the things that I wanted to point out, right, is that these technologies of surveillance are human technologies as well, that they're not just mechanical. The Deadly Exchange Program campaign in Seattle is just starting. We're having our first sort of legislative meeting, if you would, in August, I believe. But we saw what happened in Durham. And what happened in Durham was amazing. It was all kinds of alliances and activists and academics coming and analyzing the through lines between those struggles and producing a very effective and targeted campaign.
Successful divestment.
Yes. But the scene in Durham looks different than the scene in Seattle. And the scene in Seattle looks different than the scene in LA, right? And it's because of these human technologies. There's currently a request for information to the Seattle City Council about their police department and who they sent to Israel for training, who funded it. We know the major factors, right? The major actors, and how long they were there, what they learned, et cetera, and how those trainings continue to influence policing policies. I mean, there's a reason Seattle Police Department does not de-escalate. It's not taught. I mean, I have a very sort of ideological rejection of police as a construct, but on its face, that is a reality. Right? So I think, in pointing to what you just said, right? Like, I think in looking at these very particular geographies of how we're navigating these complexities, like, I find it very difficult to have that conversation without considering like a human technological surveillance.
I would like to comment on that too, about the Israeli, they have the money, they have the power, they have access to governments and support of official governments, but as Rosalind said, we have networks, but our networks are not as solidified to counter this, as you said, they have so much force. The networks, BDS is not a network, it's a movement, but it's networked somehow. And, but it's not replacement, of course, for the Palestinian national movement struggle. We need also to get our house in order, like the PLO was much more effective previously with our network. Also the GUPS, the Genuine Palestinian students were all over the world, but much more, now it's all fragmented. We need to rebuild the PLO and access to the diaspora Palestinians all over. I just want to say one in the United States, one of my experiences in the 80s, we tried to create something called the Progressive Student Network, PSN. I was one of the people who worked on this as a Palestinian. I was young and I was out of energy. Still, alhamdulillah, I have some energy. We went, there was, during the Kent Anniversary Massacre, and we had a big conference there. And Palestine was not still on the agenda. And we tried to introduce this in the agenda in the Progressive Student Network. We had progressive student groups around the campus, and we built, I don't know what happened with this PSN, but it was a national. There was 500 people at one, we had it in Iowa, and in Kent, there were like maybe 700 people coming from all over the United States, not working progressive students, and we put Palestine on the agenda. And I remember I said, we don't need, I stood up and I spoke, because a lot of Zionists were there, they wanted to talk about everything, Latin America, but when it came to Palestine, no. I said, we don't need liberal Zionists in our movement. And I remember at that time. Anyway, I just wanted to mention. Last thing I would like to say about this networking, I was suggesting, and we did this, remember Bob and the people who were in Nablus, maybe have something like, I suggested the name of Palestinian Academic and Activist Network. So to really connect the activists and the academics in a network somehow, because we have academics who are activists, but then we have, like my friend, the philosopher of the street, he's not an academic, but he can contribute a lot to this. So bringing the activists and the academics.
We have a few more questions, I see.
First of all, thank you so much for all of your presentations. My name is Tori. I'm from UC Davis. Spent many years doing this work, and it was really meaningful and special to have you presenting this work here at WOCMES for reasons which y'all articulated. I was moved not just because of the years I spent working and your very, very important analysis, but also because for the last couple of years, 8 in particular, I've been working with a group of Syrian activists and educators who are trying to do very similar work to you, both inside Syria and in exile. And all of these revolutionaries, I mean, everyone that I work with have been inspired for decades by your work, decades. And yet, because of unfortunate geopolitical reasons, they're unable to have conversations like this in the region. I work in Lebanon. And so anyway, I'm wondering, this is a very different plane of conversation, so you don't have to entertain this, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to entertain a brief conversation about, if you had advice to give a group of folks who are finding themselves the new Palestinians of the world, millions of refugees who were made refugees because of political opinions, who can't go back to their home. They're trying to figure out how to continue their own political education and resist not only the regime that made them refugees, but also regimes of humanitarian logics that continue to make them refugees in their site of exile. Lots of folks, again, in Lebanon and in Germany, both of the sites I work with, are trying to think about, what political education in this contemporary moment might look like. So anyway, in the honor of solidarity, I'm wondering if you might have some advice.
Can I just briefly say, and then maybe other people who know more want to say more, but my sense is that it's really meaningful to deepen an analysis of one's particular position, and I think that that's true for Palestinian people, and it's true for people in struggle in many places, and for Syrian people, I'm sure that there's a sense that that kind of education and study needs to happen. But I also think that coalition is so important, and that if we're talking about the production of a movement, that producing a discourse around refugees and the control of borders and the lack of livable conditions for people all over the world is so meaningful, and so I would hope that you guys would be able to do some of that, and I would guess that you're already there.
One of the things that I was thinking about after we respond to the collective conversation that we're having is how a lot of what we're discussing now are educational spaces that emerged specifically because of the colonial violences. And so, interestingly, like when you're talking about the attempted co-optation of homeless as like Israeli, you're using homeless as an educational tool. You're using a cultural festival that was the university strong-armed Zionists onto as an educational tool. You're using a mock wall as an educational tool. You're using a classroom that came about and it was inspired by the what you termed the normalization of hyper-racism. You're using in your open classroom using a former detention center and a prison as a platform to build anti-colonial knowledge. And so this is one of the things that I think is really interesting is how, when we're talking, is that how that these very violent colonial sites are then not necessarily repurposed, but it's so oppositional to the construction of it that they're transformed into these sites of resistance, into these sites of justice, and they bring about something in my space. They can now be in additional spaces to think through justice, to think through reparations, to think through liberation. And I think that one of and I don't know, that's just something that I was thinking about as we were discussing, is that it's not necessarily one of the things that we talk about is how do you, this whole debate of anti-colonial and decolonial, right? So you can't simply unweave colonialism. And you can't simply, unweave the colonial violence. But you can, and I think you talked about it in other things, is that in its creolization, in its hybridity, completely restructure and rethink and retool these spaces, these violent spaces, into a liberatory project. And so that was just something that I was thinking about.
I would like to comment about the Syrian issue, because actually all the issues are connected. And within the framework of this imperialist, colonialist intervention, okay, and the Zionist, role in that. I mean, it's not even conspiracy theory. The Zionists worked hard to destroy Iraq. If you just Google Martin Indyk, from the dual containment policy of the United States to destroy Iraq, and they destroy Iraq. And if you read the Zionist plan for the Middle East in the 1980s, it was a well-thought plan, and they did it. And Syria, was next, and they worked on it. And it's tragically, and a lot of those refugees are Palestinian. And from Yarmouk, or I met on my trip, I've been traveling through Europe, I met Syrian refugees everywhere. And what we can, and look, the tragedy is the Syrian community, the Syrian is divided, pro or against. But if we look at it within the context of who destroyed Syria and for what purpose, the reactionary regimes, can you imagine that MBS, Saudi Arabia wants to bring democracy to Syria? And they're the ones who are doing the deal of the century, okay? And Iran is the enemy, whatever, repackaging the Middle East, destroying for the sake of for Israel. And now, all this tragically, I have many Palestinian friends who work as volunteers and who risk their lives in Greece to take Syrian refugees, who come across the border from. We have Palestinians actually working. I have some of my friends, like maybe 5 or 6 friends, who are now in Brussels and Sweden, helping Palestinian refugees, helping Syrian refugees, get to safety. But how can we, this is really big, it's huge, and we need maybe to fight the causes that destroyed. We need to struggle against the causes. Now we have Trump, okay? And Israel is still working, and probably they destroyed Yemen, and nobody's talking about Yemen. Like nobody talked about Gaza, nobody's talking about Yemen. Yemen, where is Yemen here? I don't know, there was
tomorrow there will be a
it's crazy.
Yemen, yeah.
1/3. I watched the other day, sorry, I watched a lecture by a CIA operative on Brookings Institute. He's been the responsible for the file of the Saudis for 30 years. So he spoke about, now he wrote a book about Saudi Arabia and Israel and
Yeah, Robert Beer.
yeah, I don't know if you saw his YouTube stuff. 1/3 of their reserves were depleted on Yemen. On Yemen, they made it into powder. Okay? This reactionary regimes, okay, sorry. Yeah, I know. Probably, God, who's going to help me now? The reactionary regimes or the Israelis? Well, anyway. No, well, turn it off now. It's 52 years I've been shot. Anyway, but we have to speak out. We have to speak out. And I don't know what advice they need to get their act together with Palestinians. The fragmentation between Hamas and Fatah is similar. They're building on it and bring the people together on I don't know, on what kind of platform, but I don't know, very
So what I wanted to do really quickly is because we are short on time, and I did want to give an opportunity for all of the panelists to provide reflections, responses, answer questions they wish were asked but we didn't have time to address. I wanted to give you that opportunity to so that's why I'm saving the last few minutes for that. So please. Thank you.
I think just related to what we were just talking about, and related to overall what we've been talking about, just this idea, especially when we're talking about students. My job was to represent, students in diaspora, students who are children of immigrants or have been here for generations, or even refugees. And the thing that I found was that they tend to want to isolate themselves because of this idea that my struggle is my own and only my community is going to understand my struggle. And to a degree, that's true. But that same idea of coalition building, that same idea of recognizing interwoven struggles is enormously important. So the office that we had was, maybe a 16th of the size of this room. But it would hold 16 to 20 people at one point. And the thing that we would like to do is just kind of bring them in for tea, a shared cultural thing, and just have them share experiences with one another. And it was very, very natural. They just kind of shared stories of growing up. And that idea of looking at even just, again, sharing stories through that coalition building, through that narrative building, not only helps them psychologically, their psychological health and their emotional mental well-being, but also just this idea of educating one another. Because if Amani had never told me about her family stories, I would have never known, right? It didn't become real to me until I had someone who was directly affected by it, as unfortunate as that is, right? It's the same thing for me and my family. People don't know what it's like in Egypt unless I tell them. It's the same for a Syrian friend of mine, an Afghan friend of mine, and go on, right? And we had offices that were across from one another, so even beyond looking people who are Middle Eastern, there were different offices for Black students, for Latinx students, and we could just cross the room and be in their office and be able to share those experiences. And that I think is that form of teaching is so underrated, but I think it's enormously powerful.
I just want to have a very quick point, and kind of in response to you, Saed, and to you, Brooke, too, because one thing that I couldn't stop thinking about was this idea of trauma, right? That people are constantly reliving trauma. Judith Butler has a theory about trauma, right? That it's a moment in the present that we constantly relive and can never fully comprehend, right? So when we're thinking about these things in response to your question about Syria and the relationship, I think it oftentimes becomes overwhelming, right? Because we say, oh, we need to recognize the through lines between these struggles. But then when you do that, you're like, oh my God, this is global. This is the world. This is every single story And if we're empathetic people, we tend to think, how do I contribute to a solution? And then it becomes too big for any one person to handle, I think. Whether you're an activist, whether you're an academic, whether you're both, whether you're a human being, I think the point that I want to leave, though, is that that's why this project is so important, right? Because we're bringing people together in ways that we really don't see a lot in the academy or outside of it. So that's not necessarily an answer, but I think it's at least my perhaps naive sense of optimism that the work we're doing and the constant generation of productive discourse and challenging each other is something that moves that needle a little bit. That's all.
To the question about the Syrian activists, so when I started Super, like I had told you guys, it started as a group of Jewish graduate students who were white and who really just wanted to read about the PFLP and prominent Zionist speakers, and it was great for them. There was a lot of internal education going on, but not a lot of people knew about Super, not a lot of people on campus knew about Palestine. So when, in turn of fate, obviously we talked about turnover, a lot of graduate students graduated, a lot of graduate students went on to their callings, and we took over, and by we, I mean like 2 Palestinian women, my friend and Brianna and myself, and we transformed Super. And the way we did that was by making it as authentically Palestinian as we possibly could have. And being authentically Palestinian means what? To not really ever be at home, right? To want that craving, to find home in other people, to find home in other spaces, to reclaim your spaces. That's what it meant. So what we did was we constantly, like has been the motif of the talk, right? Coalition building. We found similarities and the differences between our struggle and the struggles of other marginalized communities. We built on those similarities. We gave space to people in groups like the Black Student Union or MECHA or other groups to have and educate us. And suddenly we started building up more and more community. A lot of our members for a while, I think Brianna and myself were the only Palestinians in that group. People wanted to know more about Palestine, not because it was Palestine, not because it was exceptional, but because the similarities of other struggles were just so prominent in our work. And it's not because our work was exceptional or because Palestine was exceptional, but it was because of the coalition building that's central to activism that Palestinians have kind of run with. And that's made our movement so successful and so dangerous, like you said, to the Israeli government. So I think that's the first step, is make sure that you raise the voices of the Syrians, right, who are at the heart of their own movement. And also make sure to, obviously, coalition build as much as you possibly can and organize around that.
Yeah, I think following that, if I could just speak to the issue of the repression of speech and activism on Palestine on campuses. If it weren't for the investment of the Israeli government and Zionist organizations in repressing that kind of speech and activism, I think it would be pretty obvious that most activists and progressive people would obviously be on the side of justice for people in Palestine and Palestinian people all over the world. And it's really a crime, like these false accusations of anti-Semitism and the idea that Palestine solidarity activism makes students feel unsafe, which is absolutely a lie. And so anybody who's addressing this issue really has a responsibility to expose those mechanisms of demobilization for what they are. They're absolutely a political activity that has nothing to do with making Jewish students feel good or feel comfortable or have access to education, which Jewish students across the United States actually have and feel fine about in every way. And so I think that those, like really for Jewish people and for certainly Israeli people, exposing those mechanisms of repression is really the best thing that we could do to just allow for people's stories and for these coalitions to be built. It's really obvious.
Okay, great. I would like just to show you this. This is kind of an exhaustive list that I developed that brings the struggle for justice, okay? But it's not always like we have to struggle for, but we have, all for and against. And I think this issue either on Palestine or bring all the issues together. So there is like, I guess, injustice, oppression, dictatorship, colonialism, imperialism, war, racism, colorism, sexism. We have to agree on this as people who believe in human rights, believe in justice, believe in the indivisibility of justice. And against, not only against, for justice, for freedom, for equality, you know. I just wanted to bring this up because I was doubling it, and a local Palestinian group wanted to make it into a poster. I said, okay, you can take it, no problem. The last, I would like to say, I use poetry as and I would like to end with a poem. This really, the power of words, where it can travel, it's really amazing. I wrote a poem called My Fast Bike. I wrote it during the invasion of 2002 because I used to have a bike and I couldn't ride it anymore because we have tanks. This was in April. And if you allow me just to tell the story, okay? So I couldn't ride my bike, so then I wrote a poem called My Fast Bike. I imagined a Palestinian kid and an Israeli soldier in a tank. It says like this: I rode my bike, he rode his F-16 and tank. I sang my song, he shot me and gained his rank. I'm a martyr now and did not go to school. He's the civilized one and I'm the fool. No matter what I said, his story is right. Every day he tells you, terrorism we fight. My tree uprooted, my house blown, my land confiscated, my grandmother's moan. They imprison me, they cut my flesh, they break my bone. Then the boy tells the soldier, don't kill me today, don't kill me today. I have a better option. Let's race and see who's faster. The one who wins becomes master. I on my bike, you on your tank. The one who reaches first to the land of love will tell the story for the coming generation. And this is, okay, this is a poem, but this is the power of words when it travels. By accident, I was Googling my name to show somebody how to use YouTube. And look what I found. This is the last couple of years ago. This is the last thing. This is, here, yeah, okay. This is crazy. And this is very
I felt very emotional on my way to do the Rubble Bucket Challenge here today. And part of the reason it's difficult to sum up the experience of Palestinians is that they've undergone so much suffering. So actually the most effective way of summing up what experience is like to be a Palestinian is through poetry. And I'd just like to share with you this poem that came through London Palestine Action by Saed Abu Hijleh. My first bike. I rode my bike. He rode his F-16 and tank. I sang my song. He shot me and gained his rank. I am the terrorist, and he is the victim. I am a martyr now, and do not go to school. He is the civilized one, and I am the fool. No matter what I say, his story is right. Every day he tells you, it's terrorism we fight. My tree uprooted, my house blown, my land confiscated, my grandmother's moan. I am imprisoned, they cut my flesh, they break my bone. Do not kill me today, I've a better option. Let us race and see who's faster. The one who wins will become master. You on your tank, me on my bike. He who first reaches the land of love will tell the story for the coming generation. Sorry.
I want to thank all the panelists today. Round of applause for that. And I want to remind everybody that we, at 5 p.m. sharp, we're going to have the closing plenary and roundtable discussion titled Critical Questions and Future Direction for